He checked the footage and nearly stopped breathing because there on the screen was his own son, calmly plotting his murder. David and Melissa whispered about staging an electrical accident turning his basement into a death trap for the man who raised him. The insurance payout was all they cared about, not his life, not his love, not the decades of sacrifice. Watching his son nod along the father felt a rage sharper than any blade of betrayal so deep it burned. What kind of child does this to his parent? Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from because the next move he made will leave you stunned. Richard stood in the quiet of his workshop, the hum of freshly wired circuits filling the air like a song only he could hear. His fingers, hardened by 40 years of work, traced the smooth edge of the control panel. Every screw tightened, every wire secured, was a reminder of the life he had built with his own 2 hands. He wasn't just fixing a camera system. He was touching the legacy of his craft, a house he had raised from foundation to rooftop back in 1995. He remembered hauling lumber in the Ohio heat, pouring concrete with sweat dripping down his face, setting beams while Margaret handed him lemonade from the porch. She had been the heart of this home, her laughter still lingering in corners of every room. When she passed 8 years ago, he had thought about selling, but each nail, each floorboard, each light fixture carried her memory. Selling would have been like erasing her, so he stayed. The October air outside carried the bite of early winter, but inside his house, warmth radiated from every corner. The cameras now blinked green with life lenses capturing every angle in crystal clarity. For 2 weeks they had been nothing but dead glass eyes after a surge fried the circuit. He had cursed under his breath that day, frustrated at himself for letting the system go so long unrepaired. But now, standing here seeing them alive again, he felt that rare satisfaction only a craftsman knows. This wasn't about money or showing off. It was about mastery, about knowing the wires inside these walls as well as he knew the lines on his own hands. At 65, his eyes strained more than they used to, and his back ached after long hours. But when it came to electricity, his touch was steady as stone. He smiled faintly, feeling the familiar pride of a man who refuses to grow useless. He thought of his son David, and how different their worlds had become. David, who always wanted the quick answer the easy way, who thought fixing things was beneath him. Richard remembered the day his boy turned 16 and refused to help patch the roof, choosing instead to disappear with friends while Margaret tried to soothe her husband's disappointment. That same impatience had followed David into adulthood, into his restless job history, into his gambling debts. Richard suspected but never fully confirmed. Still, he had opened his home when David needed a place, still offered that $700 allowance every month. That was what fathers did, even when their children didn't understand the weight behind it. The repaired cameras stared back at him, their tiny red dots glowing like watchful eyes. He leaned back in his chair, letting the satisfaction settle into his bones. For years he had trusted too easily. Trusted David's excuses, trusted Melissa's smiles, trusted that blood and marriage meant loyalty. Tonight that trust felt thinner than the wiring insulation he had just replaced. Melissa's laughter earlier in the driveway had set something off in him, that brittle, high-pitched sound that once charmed him but now scraped against his nerves. Her questions at dinner about property values, insurance policies, and how much the house might be worth, it was too deliberate, too polished. She had slipped it into conversation like a blade into soft flesh, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he noticed. Richard set down his tools and moved to the living room. The house creaked softly under his steps the way old houses do when autumn settles in. On the mantel sat a photo of Margaret, hair-lit copper by a summer sunset, smiling like she carried secrets only she understood. He stared at it, wondering what she would have said about tonight. She had always been the sharp one, the one who saw through masks. She would have told him to trust his gut, to pay attention to what wasn't being said, and she would have been right. The phone rang, jolting him from thought. It was Mrs. Patterson next door, her voice tight with panic over a leak in her basement. Without hesitation, he promised to come by. That was who he was, the man neighbors called when things broke, The man who would climb ladders. Others feared crawl into crawl spaces younger men complained about. He grabbed his coat, forgetting entirely that he hadn't told David or Melissa about the cameras coming back online. It seemed trivial at the time, a small detail for tomorrow. He could mention it over coffee, maybe even test the system with them watching. The night passed with that same chill riding the wind. Richard lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. He told himself it was just unease. Maybe the memories of Margaret pressing too heavily. Maybe the way Melissa's eyes had lingered on his dining room table, like she was appraising it for resale. By morning, the unrest hadn't left. He carried it with him into the workshop, coffee steaming beside him, monitors flickering to life one by one. The clarity was startling, every angle of his home alive, every corner under watch. He adjusted the view on the basement feed, satisfied at the perfect coverage. His lips curled into the faint smile of a soldier preparing defenses, not knowing the war had already begun. For a moment he let himself drift into memory. The scent of sawdust when he built the porch, the sound of rain hammering the roof while Margaret brewed coffee. David as a child running through the halls with sneakers squeaking, begging his dad to fix his broken toys. Those toys had been simple to repair, plastic screws, batteries. But somewhere along the way, the boy himself had become broken in ways no screwdriver could fix. That thought landed like a weight in Richard's chest, but he shoved it aside. There was still time, he told himself. Time to guide, to protect, to hope. Then came the sound that snapped everything into place, the click of a key in the front door. He froze, eyes fixed on the monitor, as David and Melissa stepped inside at 10:15 a.m., moving with the confidence of people who believed no one was watching. They shouldn't have been there. They weren't supposed to be there. His hand hovered near the intercom, his instinct screaming to confront them. But something in their movements stopped him cold. The way Melissa's head tilted, the way David's shoulders hunched. They weren't visiting. They were searching. They thought the cameras were dead. Richard leaned forward, the taste of metal in his mouth as their voices came through crisp and clear. Melissa's words were like ice water poured down his spine. Sunday morning. Electrical accident. Completely believable. David's nervous protest. Melissa's sharp retort, the mention of life insurance, of debts. Richard felt the room shrink around him, the pride of his craft turning instantly into the realization that the very system he had repaired was the only thing keeping him alive. The warmth of accomplishment had evaporated. The house he had built with love and sweat was no longer just a home. It had become a battlefield, and he was standing at the center of it. He knew then with a chilling certainty that everything he cherished, his life, his legacy, the memory of Margaret, was now under siege. And the siege wasn't coming from strangers. It was coming from the very son he had raised, from the woman who had smiled at his table. The cameras caught it all, every word, every whisper. Richard's hands no longer trembled with age. They steadied, hardened, transformed into the tools of a man preparing for war. He would not run. He would not be the victim they imagined. The hunter's shadow had already crossed his doorstep, but he had something they didn't: time, skill, and the knowledge that predators always underestimate their prey. What Richard decided to do next would change everything. The pot roast steamed between them, rich with herbs and the comfort of a family meal, but Richard could taste nothing. The knife in his hand sliced meat as if by reflex, his eyes fixed not on his plate but on Melissa's smile. It was too perfect a practiced performance that belonged in a boardroom, not at his dining table. She leaned forward, her tone casual but her questions cutting with precision. Had he considered updating his insurance? Did he know what houses in this neighborhood were selling for? Maybe it was time to think about what his property was worth. She phrased it as though she were concerned, but the words dripped with something colder, sharper, a calculation that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. David sat hunched beside her, poking half-heartedly at his food. His fork scraped porcelain but never carried much to his mouth. Richard studied his son, the boy he had raised after Margaret's passing. the man who once could never sit still without talking about dreams, plans, adventures. Tonight, there was only silence. David gave vague answers when pressed about his job search, his voice brittle like dry wood ready to snap. The pride Richard once felt when his son entered a room had thinned to unease. Something was wrong, not with the meal, not with the evening, but with the currents running under the surface. Richard had spent a lifetime tracing wires, diagnosing short circuits, knowing when something unseen was about to spark into disaster. That instinct hummed in his chest now, telling him this dinner was not about family. It was about leverage. Melissa's eyes kept flicking around the room, the mantel with its framed photographs, the antique clock, the leather-bound insurance folder he kept on the bookshelf. She asked questions with the smoothness of someone who already knew the answers, and when she casually mentioned the old security cameras, her voice laced with false concern, Richard's stomach tightened. She called them unreliable, suggested maybe he should get a professional to install something modern. He almost told her then that the system was already back online, freshly repaired, sharper than ever. But the phone rang, pulling him away before he could speak, and the chance slipped like sand through his fingers. When he returned from answering the call, they were already pulling on their coats. Melissa's lipstick shone under the hallway light, her voice syrupy as she thanked him for dinner. David kept his gaze low, muttering something about being tired. Richard watched them step into the cool night air, the slam of the car doors echoing too loudly in his ears. He stood there longer than he should have, the silence pressing in around him, his gut whispering that something vital had just passed between them. He couldn't shake the sense that Melissa's questions weren't casual at all, but rehearsed, designed to probe his defenses, to measure his worth not as a father but as an asset. The dishes sat untouched in the sink, their grease cooling, the scent of roasted meat clinging to the air. Richard lowered himself into his armchair, but there was no comfort in its familiar shape. His hands clenched on the armrests, knuckles white as he thought of Melissa's pointed smile. He had seen that look before, not on her face, but in boardrooms when contractors tried to underbid his work, and salesmen's grins when they thought they had him cornered. It was the look of someone closing a deal, not sharing a meal. He replayed every detail of the evening in his mind. The way David avoided his gaze when Melissa spoke of money. The way her hand rested lightly on his son's arm, tightening just slightly when Richard asked about job prospects. It wasn't affection. It was control. Richard recognized it now, the way wires could be twisted together until one dominated the flow and the other became useless. David had once been bright, full of his mother's warmth, but now he seemed dimmed, overshadowed by the woman beside him. Richard wondered if Melissa's interest in property values was really about securing a future for her and David, or simply for herself. He stood and moved into the hallway, pausing at the family photographs. Margaret's face smiled back at him, frozen in moments when life was simple. David, as a boy in his Little League uniform, his first car parked crookedly in the driveway, his college graduation where Richard had cheered the loudest. Those memories clashed violently with the man who had sat at his table tonight, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. Richard wanted to believe it was stress that his son was drowning under bills or failures he didn't know how to confess. But Melissa's voice replayed in his ears like static. Insurance, property, value. Each word felt less like conversation and more like preparation. The night deepened and the house settled with the groans of old beams in the cold. Richard poured himself a small glass of whiskey, something he rarely did, and sipped it slowly. The burn in his throat felt cleaner than the bitterness in his chest. He had always been a man of reason, someone who solved problems with logic, not suspicion. But his instincts told him the ground beneath his feet was shifting. Trust once solid as the foundation he poured decades ago was beginning to crack. He tried to picture Melissa when David first introduced her, bright-eyed, laughing, so eager to win his approval. Back then he had thought she was a blessing, someone who could ground his restless son. But over the years her smile had hardened, her laugh had sharpened, and her questions tonight had stripped away any illusion. This was not a woman seeking family. This was a woman calculating risk and reward, weighing his life the way an investor weighs a failing stock. Richard set the empty glass on the table, the clink loud in the silence. He walked back to his workshop where the glow of the monitors painted his face in pale light. The house spread out before him in crisp angles, every room captured, every shadow watched. Pride had filled him when he fixed those cameras. Tonight that pride deepened into something else entirely. Resolve. The unease of dinner had confirmed what his gut already knew: something was wrong, and it was coming for him. He leaned closer to the screens, adjusting the angles, double-checking the feeds. For years he had been the man who kept things running smoothly for everyone else. The neighbor with tools at the ready, the father with open hands, the widower who swallowed loneliness quietly. But as the cameras stared back, Richard felt the first stirrings of something sharper. He was no longer just maintaining a house. He was fortifying a battleground. The unease of dinner had cracked open the truth. His son was not the boy in the photographs anymore, and Melissa was not the smiling bride he once welcomed. They were something else now, something darker. Richard didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew the questions Melissa had asked were not about curiosity. They were about control. And control was something he would not give up so easily. The night passed slowly. Every creak in the floorboards magnified every gust of wind, sounding like footsteps at his door. He didn't sleep. He sat in his workshop, the hum of the system steady in his ears, the faint red dots of the cameras glowing like sentinels in the dark. His mind replayed Melissa's words again and again until they became prophecy. And when the dawn broke, pale light spilling through the blinds, Richard's hands were steady, his jaw set. The unease of dinner was no longer just suspicion. It was a warning. And the moment he saw what the cameras would show him next, he would learn just how deadly that warning truly was. The phone call came just as Richard was about to speak, Melissa's probing words still hanging in the air like smoke. Mrs. Patterson's voice trembled on the other end, desperate and apologetic about a water leak in her basement. She had no one else to call, and of course Richard, the man who had wired half the block back when everyone was younger, agreed without hesitation. He grabbed his coat, glanced back at David and Melissa, who were already sliding into their jackets, and told them he'd be back later. They smiled politely, Melissa's lips curving with a sweetness that somehow felt poisonous, and stepped out into the cool night. Richard closed the door behind him, the weight of the moment evaporating under the urgency of a neighbor's need. He didn't know then that he had just left the most important sentence of his life unsaid. The walk across the lawn to Mrs. Patterson's house felt routine, the kind of neighborly duty he had performed countless times over the years. Her basement smelled of mildew and old cardboard, the pipes hissing under his touch as he adjusted the valve. She hovered nearby, thanking him over and over, her frail hands wringing the edge of her cardigan. Richard smiled gently, reassuring her that it was nothing, just a quick fix, happy to be useful. He lingered longer than he needed, perhaps because he enjoyed the feeling of being depended on. Perhaps because he was reluctant to return to the strange undercurrent that had soured his own dinner table. By the time he stepped back into the crisp October air, David and Melissa's car was gone. Their absence should have been unremarkable. Instead, it left a hollow unease pressing against his chest. Inside his home, the silence was too sharp. He placed his tools back in the workshop, his mind turning back to Melissa's questions the way David had looked anywhere but at him. He almost laughed at himself for the thought that nagged him. He had meant to tell them the cameras were up again, that the system was sharper than ever, but it had slipped away in the rush of the call. It seemed so trivial. What difference could it possibly make whether they knew the cameras were alive or not? He poured himself a glass of water, staring at the faint red dots glowing steadily across the monitors. It was harmless, he told himself, but some part of him felt the weight of omission, like a fuse quietly burning toward something unseen. That night he lay awake in his bed, eyes tracing the faint shadows cast by the streetlight outside. He thought of Margaret again, her voice reminding him that small details mattered, that it was always the little things that changed the course of life. He remembered the time he almost left a wire uninsulated, how her reminder saved him from a shock that could have ended everything. Forgetfulness wasn't in his nature. He had been a man defined by precision, by attention. The fact that he had let such a detail slide tonight gnawed at him. He promised himself he would mention it tomorrow over coffee, maybe while David played with his phone and Melissa pretended to be interested. Yes, he would tell them then, and the unease would vanish. But the unease did not vanish. It followed him through the next morning, clinging like the smell of last night's roast. He tried to bury it in routine, making coffee, fixing a loose hinge on the back door, tinkering in his workshop. The cameras stared back at him from the monitors, each angle a reminder of his forgotten words. He adjusted them, tested. The audio leaned in to listen to the faint hum of the refrigerator, captured clear as day. The system was flawless now, better than it had ever been, a quiet guardian in every corner. He felt a flicker of pride, then shook his head, annoyed at how something so small could unsettle him. Still the thought lingered. Why had Melissa been so curious about them? Why had her smile tightened when she mentioned the cameras? By afternoon, the October chill had seeped into the house. Richard wrapped himself in an old sweater, the kind Margaret had always teased him for never throwing away, and sat with his coffee by the monitors. The memory of Melissa's voice replayed in his mind. Her questions weren't casual. They were calculated. He knew that now with a clarity that tightened his throat. David had looked uncomfortable but not surprised. Melissa's interest in insurance property values and the cameras wasn't coincidence. It was intent. And the fact that he had forgotten to reveal the camera's revival felt suddenly like fate drawing a line in the sand. The evening passed with the usual quiet rhythms, but his mind refused to rest. He replayed the dinner in his head, every flicker of Melissa's eyes, every twitch of David's jaw. He told himself again it was nothing, that he was letting suspicion grow wild. Yet beneath that denial was the stubborn hum of instinct, the same instinct that had saved him countless times when faulty wiring threatened fire. Instinct never lied, and his was screaming now. He tried to ignore it, but the silence of the house seemed to amplify it, until even the tick of the old clock on the wall felt accusatory. As darkness pressed against the windows, Richard returned once more to the workshop. He adjusted the monitors again, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. He stared at the glowing feeds, wondering what he was searching for. What part of him refused to believe the lie of an ordinary evening? The omission of his words, forgotten in the rush of neighborly duty, had become something else now, something heavier, something that pulsed like a warning in the back of his mind. He leaned closer, eyes fixed on the stillness of his empty living room, and whispered to himself words that carried the weight of prophecy. Sometimes what we forget to say becomes the only thing that saves us. What Richard didn't know, as he sat surrounded by the quiet hum of his handiwork, was that the house itself was about to speak back to him. The cameras, alive and unblinking, would soon reveal truths darker than suspicion, secrets that would turn his forgotten warning into the sharpest weapon of his life. And when that moment arrived, there would be no room left for doubt. Richard sat hunched over the monitors, the glow painting his weathered face in shades of gray. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. David's figure appeared on the screen, his posture stiff, his steps deliberate. Melissa trailed just behind her heels, clicking softly on the hardwood floor, though the cameras captured the sound in crisp detail. Richard leaned forward, breath caught in his chest. They weren't supposed to be here. It was mid-morning and David had mentioned job interviews. Melissa had errands. But here they were, moving through his house as though it already belonged to them, as though he were nothing more than a ghost. Melissa's voice sliced through the stillness. Sunday morning, she said, her tone steady, precise, like someone reciting a script. Electrical accident in the basement. Completely believable. He tinkers down there all the time. Her words hung in the air, cold and deliberate. Richard's hand trembled against the armrest, though his eyes never left the screen. David's response came low, hesitant, a man caught between duty and desperation. "Jess, this feels wrong. He's my father." Melissa's eyes cut toward him, sharp as a blade. "It's survival, David. You know what's at stake. His life insurance covers everything. The house alone is worth $600,000. This solves all our problems." Richard's chest tightened, each syllable pressing down like a weight. He had known unease had sensed manipulation, but hearing it confirmed broke something inside him. His own blood, his son standing in his living room nodding under the poisonous sway of a woman who saw human life as nothing more than a ledger entry. Melissa's voice dripped with contempt, recounting debts, opportunities, futures that hinged on his death. David's silence was worse than agreement. It was surrender. On another feed, Richard saw Melissa rifling through his desk drawers, pulling out insurance papers, flipping through them with clinical detachment. She moved like she'd rehearsed this before every motion efficient practiced. Her words followed her hands. The fall will look natural. A delayed call to 911. By the time help arrives, it's too late. Grieving children, tragic accident payout secured. The matter-of-fact cruelty chilled him more than any threat could have. She didn't just plan to kill him. She intended to erase him, to fold his entire life into a convenient story for the coroner. Richard gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. The workshop around him seemed to blur. He heard Margaret's laugh echoing in his mind, the memory of her telling him once that their son had inherited his father's stubbornness. But stubbornness was nowhere to be found in the man on that screen. What Richard saw now was weakness, fear, and betrayal woven into the shape of his only child. The boy he had once taught to ride a bike, the boy he had carried on his shoulders to see fireworks, was now complicit in planning his murder. Melissa's voice lowered almost conspiratorial as she spread documents across the coffee table. Sunday morning, 8 o'clock. He goes down to the basement like always. The wiring is old, the equipment looks dangerous. One slip, one spark, and it's over. Richard felt the words pierce him, each detail designed to make his death believable, even inevitable. His breath grew shallow, but his mind sharpened. He had lived his entire life solving problems others didn't see. Circuits, connections, faults hidden behind walls. And now, staring at his son and daughter-in-law plotting his end, he recognized the pattern for what it was. A system of lies ready to collapse if the right wire was pulled. David's voice broke the silence. And if someone asked questions, Melissa didn't flinch. She mentioned names, other victims, men and women who had supposedly died of accidents, falls, strokes. Her tone was so casual that Richard felt his stomach churn. These weren't accidents. These were rehearsals. Melissa wasn't just desperate. She was experienced. A predator cloaked in the language of tragedy. The realization struck like lightning. He wasn't facing family greed. He was staring into the eyes of a practiced killer. Richard sat back, his mind racing. His first instinct was to storm into the house, to drag David out by the collar, to scream at Melissa until the mask cracked. But reason overpowered fury. They didn't know the cameras were working. They believed themselves invisible, and in that belief lay his advantage. For the first time since Margaret's death, Richard felt something more than grief or loneliness. He felt purpose, fierce and unshakable. His silence had become a weapon. His forgotten warning transformed into the single thread that kept him alive. He watched as Melissa stacked the papers neatly, her hands precise, controlled. David's face flickered across the screen, pale, conflicted, but motionless. The boy Richard had raised was gone, replaced by a man too weak to resist, too broken to stand against the poison at his side. A surge of grief welled in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Grief could come later. For now, he needed clarity. The monitors glowed, each frame capturing their betrayal in high definition. Richard leaned closer, memorizing every word, every gesture. His years as an electrician had taught him patience. He knew the value of waiting, of watching, of acting only when the timing was perfect. And this was no different. He couldn't stop the wires from humming, couldn't stop the current from flowing, but he could choose when to throw the switch. When Melissa finally led David out of the house, her voice still crisp with authority, Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He sat back, hands pressed against his thighs, heart pounding against his ribs. The cameras had shown him the truth, a truth more savage than any nightmare. His son was no longer just lost. He was compromised, consumed. And the woman at his side was no longer a guest in Richard's house. She was an executioner sharpening her blade. The house settled back into silence, the creak of old beams echoing faintly, but Richard no longer heard it as he once had. Every sound now carried weight, every shadow held possibility. He looked again at the monitors, the stillness of the rooms, and felt the cold steel of decision settle into him. He could no longer think like a father. He had to think like a survivor. And survival meant more than staying alive. It meant striking before they did, turning their own design against them. The monitors kept watch as Richard straightened his back, his resolve hardening. He would not be their victim. He would not be their easy payday. They thought they had written his ending, but they had forgotten who built this house, who wired every socket, who knew every flaw and strength hidden in its bones. They had underestimated him, and that he realized with chilling certainty would be their undoing. What Richard did next would not be driven by anger nor by grief. It would be shaped by precision, by patience, by the same discipline that had carried him through a lifetime of labor. The predator believed she had chosen her prey. But Richard Brooks was about to show her that some prey know exactly how to bite back. And when Sunday morning arrived, it would not be his body at the bottom of the basement stairs. It would be the truth, unmasked, undeniable, and waiting for them in the cold glare of justice. Richard's chest felt as though a vice had clamped down on it, each turn of the screw driving deeper, as he listened to his son's voice, low, conflicted, but still conceding. David's whisper was faint, trembling with hesitation, but his head had bowed in silent agreement, and that gesture cut sharper than any blade. Richard's spirit cracked under the weight of it. He had raised this boy alone after Margaret's death, patching skinned knees, holding him through nightmares, sacrificing his own comforts to put him through school. Every memory surged, like a tide colliding with the horror of what now stared back at him through the lens his son transformed into an accomplice to his own destruction. The betrayal was not just in the words or in the nod. It was in the hollow absence of resistance. Richard knew weakness when he saw it. Years of labor had taught him the difference between a line that carried current and one that sagged, uselessly drained of power. David had once been strong, full of potential, but Melissa had stripped him bare. She had wrapped herself around him like a snake, whispering promises of wealth and escape, until the boy who once wanted to be an architect now sat plotting his father's death for the sake of debt collectors and a greedy spouse. Richard pushed back from the desk, his chair groaning against the concrete floor of the workshop. His fists clenched, nails biting into his palms. The urge to storm into the night to drag his son out of that poisoned orbit tore through him. But the cameras had given him something more dangerous than rage. They had given him clarity. The boy he loved had been poisoned, yes, but he had still chosen to drink. And that choice cut deeper than Melissa's manipulation. Memories clawed at him. The Christmas mornings when David had barely been able to wait for dawn before tearing down the stairs. The day he had taught him to drive Margaret, watching nervously from the porch as the car lurched down the gravel driveway. Richard had always told himself that despite the flaws, despite the arrogance and impatience, his son would one day find his footing. But what he saw now was not a stumble. It was a fall into darkness. The workshop smelled of oil and dust, a space that had always been a sanctuary now transformed into a war room. Richard paced the length of it, the hum of the monitors filling the silence. Betrayal had a taste metallic and bitter, sitting heavy on his tongue. He wanted to tell himself that David was trapped, that Melissa had cornered him, that he had no choice. But the footage replayed in his mind the nod, the silence, the surrender. Those were choices, and choices had consequences. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking so violently that it sloshed over the rim. He stared at the ripples, the distortion of his own reflection in the liquid, and wondered how a man could raise a child to become his executioner. Guilt gnawed at him. Had he worked too many hours, missed too many moments, left his son too hungry for something he could never provide? Or was this corruption seeded deeper, planted by a world that preyed on weakness until Melissa had only to give it water? The clock ticked in the corner, steady, merciless. Richard sat again, forcing himself to study the feeds with the precision of the tradesman he was. Melissa had orchestrated this, yes, but David's compliance was the nail in the coffin of Richard's trust. The man on that screen was not the boy he once carried on his shoulders. He was a stranger wearing his son's face, speaking his son's voice, but moving to another's will. The weight of isolation pressed down. Richard had no Margaret to turn to, no family he could confide in. The betrayal was total, the kind that left a man hollowed out and alone. But even in the depths of that despair, a spark remained. He had not survived 65 years by folding under pressure. He had faced storms, bankruptcy scares, accidents that could have killed him. He had walked away from them all because he understood one truth. Survival was not about strength alone. It was about resolve. Resolve steadied him now. The footage played again, Melissa's sharp words cutting David's whisper, breaking his nod, sealing the deal. Richard let the rage settle into something colder. Anger burned fast, but cold resolve endured. He would not confront them yet. He would not give them the chance to twist his grief into weakness. He would wait. He would watch, and he would strike with the precision of a man who had spent his life mastering currents and circuits. His eyes shifted to the photo of David on the wall, a boy grinning in a Little League uniform, dirt smeared across his cheeks. The image blurred with tears that refused to fall. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had traded loyalty for desperation. Richard whispered into the empty room, his voice rough with sorrow. "You were all I had." He stood then, moving with deliberate calm, every muscle taut with purpose. The monitors glowed in the dim light, silent witnesses to a betrayal so deep it could never be undone. Richard knew that trust was dead, shattered beyond repair. What remained now was strategy, survival, and the cold arithmetic of justice. He ran his fingers along the edge of the desk the same way he once tested wires for charge. The current was still there, humming in his veins, pushing him forward. Betrayal had broken something in him, yes, but it had also awakened something long buried. He was not just a father anymore. He was a man preparing for war. And as the night deepened, as the house groaned against the weight of silence, Richard felt the first embers of vengeance stir. They thought they had caged him in fear, but they had only sharpened his focus. His son's betrayal was the deepest wound of his life, but it would also become the spark that ignited what came next. And what came next would not be mercy. It would be reckoning. Richard woke the next morning with the weight of betrayal still pressing against his chest, but something had shifted. The raw ache from seeing his son's silent nod had hardened into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. Fear had clawed at him through the night, whispering of endings of funerals staged by greedy hands, of his name carved into stone too soon. But by dawn, fear no longer held the reins. Resolve had taken its place. He moved with a steadiness that surprised even him, his body remembering the rhythm of work, of preparation, of shaping chaos into order. The first call he made was to Catherine Miller, a lawyer he had known for years through church. She had drawn up his will after Margaret's passing, and was one of the few people he still trusted. When she answered, her voice carried the calm authority that had once reassured him in the darkest hours. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told her he needed ironclad documentation that he was of sound mind, that every decision he made was his own. Catherine didn't ask why, though he heard the edge in her silence. She agreed to meet him that afternoon. By mid-morning, Richard sat across from her in her office, the scent of old paper and polished wood wrapping around him. Catherine studied him carefully, her pen tapping against a yellow legal pad. "You want competency evaluations notarized and sealed," she said, her eyes narrowing, "and you want it done quickly." Richard nodded. He couldn't bring himself to explain everything, not yet, but Catherine didn't press. She simply began drafting, calling in her assistant, moving with a precision that mirrored his own. Every document she prepared was another brick in the wall. He was building a fortress against the storm he knew was coming. From there, Richard drove straight to Dr. Patel's office. The physician had known him for over a decade, treating his arthritis, his high blood pressure, the minor scrapes and aches of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. Patel looked up from his chart, adjusting his glasses. "You're asking for a full medical evaluation? Neurological, psychological, physical?" Richard's gaze didn't waver. "All of it. Every test you can give me. I want proof I'm healthy, competent, and not losing my mind." The doctor frowned, but agreed, scheduling scans and evaluations for the next morning. Richard left with the certainty that every sheet of paper, every signature, every seal would be another weapon in his arsenal. By the time he returned home, the house no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a staging ground. He moved from room to room with purpose, checking locks, tightening hinges, testing the feeds from the cameras with a meticulous eye. The basement, once just a workshop where he tinkered with old projects, became the center of his defense. He cleared shelves, rearranged tools, rewired outlets. Every adjustment was a countermeasure, every detail designed to expose the lie Melissa had planned to weave. If they wanted an accident, he would show the world there was no accident to be had. As he worked, the bitterness in his chest eased into focus. Pain became blueprint. Betrayal became architecture. Richard was no longer simply reacting. He was designing. He mapped out scenarios, rehearsed what he would say, what evidence he would hand over when the time came. He cataloged the footage, making copies, storing them on drives hidden in places Melissa would never think to look. His electrician's mind, once used to wire homes and fix neighbors' problems, was now an engine of strategy. That evening, Catherine called to confirm the documents were already underway. "You'll have notarized proof within 48 hours, she said. Richard thanked her, his voice steady, though inside he felt the fire building. Patel's office followed, with appointments lined up for early morning. Step by step, his life was being fortified, turned into something no lie could unravel. He felt steadier than he had in years, his grief transformed into steel. But even as resolve carried him, the silence of the house pressed heavily. The photo of Margaret on the mantel seemed to watch him as he worked, her smile gentle, her eyes sharp. He imagined her voice urging him on, reminding him that survival wasn't cowardice, that planning wasn't fear. He whispered to her memory as he filed the footage, promising that their son's weakness would not destroy the legacy they had built together. The night deepened, shadows stretching long across the walls. Richard sat in his workshop, monitors casting their glow across his face. For the first time in days, his hands were steady. He no longer trembled with grief or rage. He was focused, deliberate, alive in a way he hadn't felt since the days when Margaret was by his side. He was no longer just a father betrayed. He was a man preparing for war on his own terms, with tools sharper than knives and weapons deadlier than fists. And as he leaned back in his chair, watching the silent feeds of his empty home, he knew the trap was taking shape. Every document, every test, every hidden file was a snare waiting to close. Melissa believed she was clever, that she was crafting the perfect crime. David believed he was helpless, that surrender would save him. But Richard knew better. He had lived long enough to understand that predators always underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who watch, who wait, who build. The trap was not complete yet, but the blueprint was clear. And when it was finished, when the walls closed in, it would not be his obituary written in the cold ink of betrayal. It would be their undoing, caught in the very net they had cast for him. What Richard did next would ensure that when the time came, the world would see the truth with a clarity no amount of lies could blur. The report arrived in a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs, its weight far heavier than paper should allow. Richard sat at his kitchen table, the monitors humming in the background, his fingers hovering over the seal. He had hired a private investigator 2 days earlier, a quiet man named Carter Briggs, who owed him a favor from years back. Richard hadn't expected much. Maybe confirmation of debts, maybe records of Melissa's gambling, maybe proof that she had manipulated David into his silence. What he held now was something darker, more corrosive, the kind of truth that doesn't just bruise but corrodes everything it touches. He opened the envelope with hands that refused to tremble even as his heart pounded against his ribs. The first page stopped him cold. Melissa Carter was not Melissa Carter. She was Jennifer Walsh. The name leapt off the page like a curse accompanied by a string of aliases that stretched across half a dozen states. Richard's eyes scanned faster, absorbing each line with the sharpness of a man who had wired blueprints for decades. Fraud. Theft. Suspicious deaths. Every record belonged to seniors who had trusted her, let her into their homes, into their lives, only to end up ruined or dead. The paper didn't just accuse her. It cataloged her case after case like a trail of blood she never bothered to clean. Photographs slipped from the folder faces of men and women lined with years, their smiles fixed in moments long gone. Underneath each photo were words that chilled him. Heart failure, accidental fall stroke. Natural causes on the surface. But Carter's notes painted another picture. Each victim had left assets behind. Each had insurance policies mysteriously cashed by spouses or partners tied to Jennifer Walsh. Each had been isolated, their voices silenced, their protests erased under the weight of official reports. And now the predator had found her way into his own family, wearing the mask of Melissa, smiling across his table, touching his son's arm as if she belonged. Richard leaned back, his chair creaking under the pressure of his body. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tide of rage wash over him. This wasn't about greed anymore. This wasn't just a woman pushing his son into betrayal. This was a hunter refined and ruthless who had been perfecting her craft for years. David wasn't her partner. He was her weapon, reshaped and dulled until he could be used against his own blood. Richard had suspected manipulation, but the truth was worse. Melissa wasn't building a future. She was erasing the past one elder at a time, and now she had drawn a target squarely on his back. He returned to the file, his eyes sharp, devouring every detail. Jennifer Walsh had been questioned 3 times but never charged. Every case slipped through the cracks, insufficient evidence, grieving families unwilling to press further, lawyers who couldn't tie her hands to the knife she wielded. She had walked free each time, moving from state to state, changing names, shedding skins like a snake. And now she thought she had found her perfect mark, an aging widower, a son too weak to resist, and a house rich with history and value. Richard's jaw clenched, his knuckles pressing white against the edge of the table. For a moment grief returned, the grief of losing Margaret, of watching David's slow descent into Melissa's shadow, of knowing his family line had become a weapon aimed at him. But grief didn't rule him anymore. What filled his chest now was colder, sharper. He was staring at a pattern the way an electrician studies blueprints. Circuits, connections, systems, every crime she committed had been wired the same way, and he could see now where the wires crossed. He understood her design, and he understood how to break it. Carter's final note was underlined twice. She always underestimates the old ones. She counts on fear, silence, resignation. Don't be silent. Richard read it 3 times, his pulse steadying. He wasn't like the others she had preyed upon. He wasn't alone, confused, or resigned to fate. He was competent, documented, prepared. He had a lawyer drafting airtight evidence of his sound mind. He had a doctor preparing medical proof of his health. He had cameras recording every whisper of her plot. She believed she had chosen prey. What she had chosen instead was a man who had spent his life turning chaos into order, who knew that a system only works until you cut the right wire. The house felt different now. It was no longer just his fortress. It was bait, a trap, with every corner wired, every shadow illuminated. Melissa thought she was walking toward easy victory. That Sunday morning would close the book on him. But Richard could already see how it would play out. She would step into his basement expecting tragedy, and instead she would meet exposure. He would not simply survive her. He would unmask her before the world dragged Jennifer Walsh into the light, where no new name, no polished smile could save her. Richard gathered the photographs back into the envelope, his movements deliberate, reverent, as though handling the memories of strangers who had been erased by her cruelty. They deserved justice, even if it came too late. He whispered a promise into the empty room, not just for himself, but for them. She would not take another life. Not his. Not anyone's. The monitors flickered, the cameras painting his home in grainy shades of gray and green. Richard sat before them, the file heavy on the desk beside him, his reflection hard in the glass. He had lost trust in his son, but he had gained clarity in his enemy. Melissa's mask was shattered, and behind it was a predator who believed age equaled weakness. She had made her mistake. She had stepped into the wrong house. Richard leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the glowing feeds, every muscle in his body coiled with patience and precision. He was no longer waiting to be attacked. He was waiting for the moment she walked into her own ruin. The predator had shown her true face. Now it was his turn. And when he moved, when he revealed what he knew, it would not be with words or pleas. It would be with evidence, with law, with the unflinching resolve of a man who refused to be erased. The truth was out. The hunter was unmasked. And Richard was about to teach her what happens when a predator mistakes its prey for easy meat. The hours bled together, each one thick with tension, each tick of the clock reminding Richard that time was no longer a luxury, but a weapon. Less than 2 days remained before Melissa's carefully plotted Sunday morning accident, and every passing minute pressed harder against his ribs. But Richard was no longer the confused father sitting in stunned silence before a screen. He had become something sharper. His grief and betrayal hardened into strategy. Every motion in his house carried purpose, every step deliberate. His workshop, once cluttered with tools and relics of old projects, now bore the look of a command center. Detective Frank Morrison arrived just after dusk, a tall man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Richard had met him years back during a neighborhood burglary, and he knew the detective carried a reputation for stubbornness that matched his own. Frank studied the monitors, the stacks of files, the copies Richard had already made. "You've built yourself a fortress," Frank said, his voice flat but tinged with respect. Richard only nodded. There was no pride in this, no satisfaction. This was survival. He slid a folder across the table, documents Catherine had already notarized, medical reports Patel had signed, proof of his competence, sealed tight. Frank flipped through the pages, then leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "She thinks you're an old man waiting to die," he muttered. "She has no idea you've already outflanked her." Richard didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the monitors, the house mapped out in flickering light. He had set up hidden cameras in places Melissa would never suspect, behind air vents tucked into bookshelves wired through the old smoke detector in the basement. Each angle overlapped the next, leaving no blind spots, no shadows for her to hide in. Every feed was recorded, duplicated onto drives he stored in 3 separate places. One stayed in his safe, one was handed to Frank, and the third he sealed inside a box and slipped to Mrs. Patterson, under the guise of fixing her old DVD player. No single failure would erase the truth. The workshop smelled of solder and oil, the air heavy with anticipation. Richard moved through it with the precision of a man half his age, adjusting wires, labeling folders, cataloging evidence with neat handwriting. He wasn't just preparing for survival. He was preparing for Judgment Day. Melissa's plan counted on silence on his death, leaving nothing but staged tragedy. He would leave behind a record too loud to ignore, a trail so clear even the most skeptical prosecutor couldn't turn away. Sleep abandoned him. Each hour of the night stretched long, but Richard welcomed the weight of exhaustion. Fatigue sharpened his resolve, stripping away hesitation. He rehearsed scenarios in his head, playing out conversations, imagining the moment Melissa would step through the door, believing she held victory in her hands. He pictured David trailing after her, eyes down, shoulders slumped, a pawn too broken to resist. The thought stung, but he forced himself to confront it. Hope for his son was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival demanded clarity, and clarity told him David was already lost. By morning, the house was alive with invisible defenses. Every drawer Melissa had touched, every document she had rifled through. Richard marked and restored, careful not to disturb the order she would expect. He wired a tiny recorder into the lamp by the couch, another into the base of the kitchen phone. He tested each one twice, his hands steady, his mind focused. Margaret's photo watched from the mantel, her smile frozen in time, and Richard found himself whispering to it as he worked. "I won't let her win. Not with me. Not with him." The words carried both promise and curse. Frank returned in the afternoon with a small team plainclothes officers who blended into the neighborhood. They parked inconspicuously rotated shifts, watched from a distance. Richard walked them through the layout of the house, pointing out entries, exits, blind spots outside the camera range. They listened carefully, treating him not as a victim, but as an ally, a man who knew his ground better than anyone. "When she makes her move, we'll be ready," Frank assured him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Richard met his eyes, seeing not comfort, but the reflection of wariness. The detective knew as well as he did, traps work both ways, and Melissa was no amateur. The weight of time pressed harder as the second night fell. Richard sat in his workshop, the monitors casting pale light across his face, the envelope with Melissa's true identity resting beside him. He traced a finger across the bold print of Jennifer Walsh. Each letter a reminder of the predator circling his life. He thought of the victims in Carter's file. The elders who hadn't seen her mask slip, who hadn't had cameras or allies or the stubborn will to fight. Their silence burned in him, fueling the cold fire that kept him awake. He would not join their ranks. He would not let his name be added to her ledger. The house itself seemed to brace with him, its walls groaning under the October wind, its shadows stretched long across the floor. Richard tightened the last screw on a hidden mount, wiped the sweat from his brow, and leaned back in his chair. Less than 2 days. That was all the time that remained before Melissa believed she would step into a crime scene of her own making. Instead, she would step into a cage. The countdown ticked relentlessly, but Richard was no longer afraid of it. Every hour that passed brought him closer to the confrontation, closer to the moment when silence would break and truth would roar. He stared at the monitors one last time before extinguishing the workshop light, the faint red glow of the cameras pulsing like heartbeats in the dark. He knew the trap was ready. He knew the stage was set. And as the clock struck midnight, Richard whispered into the stillness, his voice steady, unyielding. "Come for me. I'll be waiting." What he didn't know yet was how swiftly the night itself would answer. Sunday morning arrived with a brittle stillness, the kind of silence that felt staged, too perfect, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Richard sat in his workshop, every monitor alive, every camera recording his body still, though his blood hammered like a war drum in his ears. The clock read 7:56 a.m. He knew the plan by heart. Melissa believed he would be in the basement by 8, tinkering with the electrical panel, unsuspecting and vulnerable. Instead, Richard was upstairs in the living room, files stacked neatly on the table, recordings, cued law enforcement hidden but waiting for the signal. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was a living thing coiled tight and ready to snap. At 8:01, the front door opened. Melissa entered first, her stride confident, her smile polished into something almost tender, as though she were about to comfort a grieving family rather than commit a murder. David followed, his shoulders hunched, his face pale, every step dragging as though he already felt the weight of chains clinking around his ankles. Richard stood in the center of the room, straight-backed, calm, the monitors behind him casting cold light into the shadows. Melissa froze for half a second, startled to see him upstairs, alive, waiting. But her mask slipped back into place with practiced speed. "Richard," she said, her voice syrupy. "You're up early. We were just going to—" He raised a hand, silencing her. No tremor, no hesitation. He pressed a button on the remote and the room filled with sound. Her own voice, crisp and cold, spilled into the air. "Sunday morning. Electrical accident. Completely believable." Her words echoed against the walls, damning her with every syllable. Melissa's smile cracked. The polish peeled away, revealing the predator beneath. Her eyes flickered between the monitors and the speakers, calculating, scrambling for a way to explain, to rewrite what was now undeniable. But Richard didn't stop. He played the next recording, her voice weaving plans, naming insurance policies, instructing David on how to delay the emergency call. Then the next, her tone sharper, her contempt laid bare, as she mocked his age, his fragility, his supposed incompetence. The evidence filled the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to breathe through. David's face crumpled. His legs buckled beneath him, and he sank into a chair, burying his head in his hands. Shame radiated off him in waves, stronger than words, stronger than tears. Richard watched him without blinking, his heart breaking but his resolve unshaken. This was no longer the boy he raised. This was a man who had traded loyalty for silence, who had nodded while his father's death was planned in detail. Melissa snapped, her voice rising brittle and sharp. "He's lying. He's twisting this. You can't prove." The slam of the door cut her off. Law enforcement stormed in plainclothes officers moving with speed and precision. Detective Morrison stepped forward, his badge flashing, his voice firm. "Jennifer Walsh, you're under arrest." The name struck like a gunshot. Melissa's face drained of color, her mask shattered completely, her body twisting as though she might run. But there was nowhere to go. The walls of Richard's house, the very house she had intended to claim through blood, closed in around her. The cameras blinked steadily, recording every second of her downfall. David lifted his head as the cuffs snapped around Melissa's wrists. His eyes darted to his father, wide with a desperate plea Richard had seen before, the plea of a boy begging for forgiveness after breaking a window, after lying about grades, after disappointing the mother who had loved him fiercely. But this was no broken window. This was betrayal carved into the bone of family. Richard held his gaze, his face hard, his voice low and final. "You chose this." The officers pulled Melissa toward the door. She screamed, then no longer polished, no longer controlled, her voice cracking as she hurled curses at Richard, at David, at the world that had finally caught her. But the words didn't matter. The evidence had spoken louder than she ever could. David's collapse was quieter. When the second pair of cuffs closed around his wrists, he didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't even look surprised. He rose slowly, as though weighted down by every debt, every choice, every moment he had surrendered himself to her control. Richard's throat tightened, grief slamming into him harder than rage ever had. Watching his son led away was a wound deeper than Melissa's schemes, deeper than the fraud and the lies. This was the final theft. She hadn't just tried to steal his life, she had stolen his son's soul. The room emptied quickly, the storm of boots and orders fading into silence. Richard stood alone in the house, the monitors still glowing, the echoes of betrayal still hanging in the air. Relief and heartbreak twisted together inside him, inseparable, unbearable. He had survived. He had won. But at what cost? His legacy was intact, his life spared, yet the boy he had once carried on his shoulders was gone, replaced by a stranger in chains. He lowered himself into the chair, the strength draining from his body at last. His eyes moved to the mantel where Margaret's photo still stood, her smile frozen eternal. He whispered into the emptiness, his voice breaking for the first time. "I did it, Maggie, but I lost him." Outside, sirens wailed faintly as the patrol cars disappeared into the distance. Inside, the cameras blinked, red, tireless sentinels that had witnessed everything. Richard rubbed his calloused hands together, the same hands that had built this home, the same hands that had raised his son, the same hands that had wired the trap that saved his life. They trembled now, not with fear, but with the weight of survival. The battle was over, but the war inside him had only just begun. And as the silence settled once more, Richard knew one truth with unshakable certainty. What came next would not be peace. It would be reckoning. The winter passed slowly, each day marked not by the tick of the clock, but by the echo of memory. Richard's house was quieter than ever, its walls carrying the phantom sounds of voices that would never return. The betrayal lingered sharp as broken glass, cutting deep whenever his mind replayed the sight of David in cuffs, shoulders bowed beneath shame. Yet as the months unspooled, grief began to take on a different weight. It didn't vanish, but it shifted, shaping him rather than crushing him. The wound was still raw, but out of it came a clarity Richard had never known before. It started small. Mrs. Patterson next door asked him to look over her locks after a pushy salesman tried to get inside. Another neighbor, Mr. Lawson, asked for advice about phone scams that had been targeting him. Richard, who had spent his life working with wires and tools, realized that his true craft was not just building, but protecting. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood if you were older, if you felt unsafe, if you thought someone was circling your home like a vulture. Richard Brooks was the man to see. He found himself repairing more than locks and cameras. He was repairing confidence. He showed widows how to recognize predatory contracts, helped retirees back up their financial records, taught couples in their 70s how to install simple camera systems that even Melissa would have struggled to spot. Each visit reminded him of the faces he had seen in Carter's file the victims Jennifer Walsh had erased. This time he would not allow anyone else to disappear into silence. Catherine encouraged him, helping him set up free workshops at the local community center. At first, only a handful attended, men with stooped shoulders, women clutching worn purses, eyes wary and tired. Richard stood before them with the same steady presence he once carried onto job sites, his voice firm, his words sharpened by experience. He didn't speak like a lawyer or a bureaucrat. He spoke like one of them, a man who had seen betrayal with his own eyes, who knew what it felt like to be targeted by the very people you trusted most. The room grew fuller with each passing week. Seniors brought their friends, neighbors whispered encouragement, and soon the workshops filled every chair. Richard demonstrated how to check for hidden clauses in contracts, how to spot false utility calls, how to set up simple alarms. He didn't dramatize, didn't sensationalize. He simply told the truth, and the truth carried more weight than fear ever could. The ache of betrayal never fully left him. Nights were still haunted by David's bowed head, by the sound of cuffs closing around wrists that had once held his hand as a child. That pain lived inside him like a scar that no time could smooth. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Richard discovered that pain could be harnessed. It could be forged into something stronger, something that didn't just protect him, but fortified others. Frank Morrison stopped by one evening, leaning against Richard's doorway as the two men shared coffee. "You're turning this neighborhood into a fortress," the detective said, half amused, half admiring. Richard shrugged his eyes on the quiet street outside. "They need it," he answered simply. "No one should go through what I did. Not if I can stop it." Frank studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then, "Maybe you're exactly what they need." Spring thawed the edges of winter, and with it came a new rhythm. Richard was no longer just a retired electrician, no longer just a widower rattling around in a too-big house. He had become a protector, a guardian of those who once thought themselves powerless. And in their gratitude, in their trust, he found a new kind of family, one that asked nothing of him but respect, and offered him the same in return. At the community center, after one of his sessions, an older woman clasped his hand with tears in her eyes. "You saved me," she whispered. "I almost signed everything away. But I remembered what you said." Richard squeezed her hand gently, a lump rising in his throat. These moments did not erase the betrayal of his son, but they gave it meaning. If his suffering could shield even one other soul, then it had not been for nothing. The monitors in his workshop still glowed at night, but they no longer reflected paranoia. They reflected vigilance. Richard sat before them not waiting for betrayal, but preparing for prevention. He had transformed his home from a would-be crime scene into a hub of resilience, a symbol that survival was not just about living, it was about fighting back, about refusing to be erased. Margaret's photo still watched from the mantel, her smile eternal, her eyes carrying the warmth that had once anchored his world. Richard spoke to her often, telling her about the workshops, about the neighbors who now walked taller, about the lives spared from vultures like Jennifer Walsh. He told her about the pain too, about David, about the hole in his heart that would never quite close. But he also told her the truth, that he was no longer defined by what had been stolen from him. He was defined by what he was building now. The betrayal would always ache, a wound etched into his soul. But Richard had chosen to rise from victim to protector, from silence to voice, from prey to guardian. The community that grew around him was bound not by blood, but by resilience, by respect, by shared wisdom. In their trust he found strength. In their gratitude he found purpose. And though the nights remained long and the memories sharp, Richard knew one thing with unshakable certainty: he was no longer waiting to be preyed upon. He was standing watch for others, ensuring no one else would fall into the traps he had escaped. The past had nearly destroyed him, but it had also remade him. And what came next would not be grief. It would be legacy. Richard's story is more than a tale of betrayal. It is a reminder that age does not mean weakness, and trust must always be paired with vigilance. For many older adults, the greatest danger does not come from strangers on the street, but from those who gain entry into our lives through charm, persuasion, or even family ties. Richard's resilience shows that preparation and awareness are powerful shields. Simple steps documenting your health and competence, securing your homekeeping records safe, and never ignoring the small red flags can mean the difference between being vulnerable and being in control. His journey from victim to protector also reveals an even greater truth, that sharing our knowledge and experiences strengthens the entire community. When one elder learns to recognize fraud, many others are spared. When one voice refuses silence, countless others gain courage. Betrayal may leave scars, but it can also forge purpose, turning pain into protection for others. If this story speaks to you, remember that your wisdom is a force the world needs. Stay vigilant, protect yourself, and share your strength with others. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the light someone else needs.